This video is part 2 of GTViewer's dynamic graphics functionality. Dynamic graphics is a visualization tool to create an alternate view of your data using a set of rules and your features attribute information. Dynamic graphics is broken into two parts: dynamic labels, which was covered in part 1, and dynamic highlighting, which is covered in this video. The easiest way to explain dynamic highlights is to give a quick demonstration. I'm going to zoom into our demo data here and let's look at some poles. All of the poles use the same symbology, this cyan bluish circle. And there's no difference in the symbology based on the pole's attributes. Now, if we zoom in close enough, we can see the label, and if you watched part 1 of these videos, it told how we can change this label to be whatever we want. We can also review the attributes on a feature to see what the information is. But if we're just looking at the poles, there's no difference in the symbology. Now, dynamic highlights will allow you to set a criteria and a color or style for all of the features that match that criteria. So let's quickly look at the examples that are provided with the demo data. One of them is called poles 40 feet or taller. And if we look at this, we'll go over the detail or the options later, but just quickly look at the criteria. This is which features it's going to apply this dynamic highlight to, and it says pole.height, the table.attribute, is greater than 40, with 40 feet. And if that's true, then the highlight is going to be red, and it's just going to use the default weight line style fill, and it only applies to visible features. Now, it's currently turned off. I'm going to turn it on and apply it, and you'll see all of these poles turned red. So these poles must be 40 feet or taller. Let's just review one to verify that. This one is indeed 40 feet. Now, if we zoom out a little, all of the poles in this data are not 40 feet. And if we look right here, this pole here is red. This pole here is still cyan. Let's look at the information on it. You'll see it's 35 feet. Now, we could have just looked at the label here. It also has 35 feet in the label. But if we zoom back out, you can see that there are several poles up here that are red, and there's several down here that are still the original color. Now, we could change the color. Let's say we want to make them green. Now they're green. We can use the emphasize mode to make it easier to see them, although I think it was easier to see them when they were red. And you can quickly identify which features match your criteria. Now, my criteria here is a little bit simplified, but it should give you an idea of what you can do, and we're going to show some more complicated ones later on. If you watch part 1, I went through the action properties in detail and did an example of each one. I'm going to quickly go through them again just in case you haven't seen part 1. And let's just go through them one by one. The active check mark here is whether or not it's on. Currently, the pole 40 feet or taller is off because the active is off. The allow emphasize means if it's checked, it means that your dynamic highlight will emphasize when the emphasize session graphics mode is turned on, because that also includes highlights. If you turn this off and you do emphasize mode, then the feature will not stay highlighted. It will gray out like all the other features, and we can quickly demonstrate that. I'll turn it back on. I'll zoom in so we can see some poles. Now, currently, if I turn the highlight session graphics on, everything grays out except my dynamic highlights, which is what we wanted. Now, if I say no for turn off the allow emphasize and apply, they gray out just like everything else. Now, if I turn emphasize mode off, they're still red when I turn them back on. So I usually leave that on, but this is completely dependent on what you're trying to do with your dynamic highlights. The description, poles 40 feet or taller, is what it appears over here in the action list. The minimum and maximum threshold, that's the zoom level range that this action will be used. And if we look on our status bar here, our zoom level is 313. So that's between 0 means there's no minimum. So that's between the minimum and the maximum of 10,000. Now if we zoomed out past 10,000, and it should turn off, but that's going to be so far out we're not going to be able to see these anyway. See, 10,000's farther than the fit, so you can't really see them. But if we go back to a more reasonable amount, let's say we're currently at 965. Let's just say this is 1,000 instead of 10,000. And if I zoom out a little bit, they turn off. And if I zoom back in, they'll turn back on. And then zoom back out. We're at 1,500 right here. I'm going to turn it back to 10,000 just so it'll always be on. The next two items here go together. Category. Your feature has to be from a specific category, or you can have more than one feature, but the ones, they all have to be from the same category. So you pick your category. In this case, poles are in the structure category. And then your feature list is the features that this dynamic highlight gets applied to. Now, it's got a feature string here, but if you do the 3-dot button, it gives you a way to select this so you don't have to know this notation, although you can key in the notation yourself if you know it. And there's several options here. You can do it by filter ID. That's probably not recommended because it can change. If your data is such that your filter IDs never change from one export to the next, then this is fine, and that's how we used to do it. But more modern times we use the by feature and component mode, and in this case the pole feature was selected, and that includes the symbol and text and anything else. Let's look at the by feature component. You'll see it was the text, the symbol, and the guy symbol. And if we zoom in, we'll have to get out of this dialog and then zoom into one so we can see it. Let's go back here, and I'm going to turn the text and the guy symbol off. And that changed our feature string a little. See, now it's pole and a component, or it's feature and component, pole and symbol. And if I apply that, see, now only the pole itself, the pole symbol, is highlighted. And I can turn that back on. And you can choose as many features as you want. It's just that your criteria has to apply to all of them. Okay, the next thing is the criteria. I've already discussed this some. I want to go through it again because this is really the most important thing here, besides the feature selection itself. And this expression is just a formula that if it evaluates to true, which is not 0, then the features that you've selected here will be processed and highlighted. So it's got pole.height to double, and a double to double function is greater than or equal to 40. So if this expression is evaluated and is true, then it's going to highlight it. If it's not true, then it doesn't do anything. So all the attributes in GTViewer are treated as strings. And so even though pole height's a number, it's still a string to GTViewer. And since we want to use this as a number, we have to convert it to a number. And there's a function to do this called toDouble. This and that's a floating point number, like 1.5. Now, I believe all the pole heights are integer values, and we could have used the toInteger or toInt function, but just to be safe, it's using toDouble, and then the toDouble pole height produces a number that is compared to 40, and it has to be greater than or equal. Now, if we use these little 3-dot button here, this is a dialog that kind of helps you build your expression. Now, you don't have to have an expression at all. You can just set it to true, and then all poles are going to be highlighted. It doesn't matter. Every pole is going to be true. that's not exactly what we want to do. I'm going to go and rebuild this again and show you how you can create one from scratch here. Let me find the pole table, and here's the height attribute. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of the true here. If you double click on one, or you click one and say add attribute, it sticks it up here in your expression line, and it always puts them in square brackets. That's because your tables and attributes can have spaces, they can have strange symbols like asterisks and things that could interfere. So if you always put them in square brackets, then it's always safe. Now I need to convert this to a number, so I'm going to say 2 double. I just put parentheses around it, and greater than or equal to, and 40. Now there's also a validate button. If I press this, it didn't do anything. That means everything's okay. Now if I had an error in here, let's say I spelled double wrong, and press validate, then it tells me there's an error, invalid expression. Now it's just highlighting what it thinks is wrong. Sometimes it gives you better information than others, but it's definitely the function name is spelled wrong. So if we fix that and say validate again, then it'll go okay. And your expression must be valid for your dynamic graphic action to be valid, and it has to be valid before it can be used. So I'm going to apply that. We could say, let's say it had to be greater than 50 and apply. You'll notice this went away because this pole is 40. And this expression can be as simple or as complicated as you want. You can do ands and ors and put parentheses, and you can search for parts of strings, or it has to begin with a string, or it has to contain a string. There's a lot you can do with these expressions, and I'm just using simple ones so that it's easier to understand for this demonstration. Now the next thing here is type. This is a simple highlight, which means any feature from this category feature list that's processed and evaluates to true for this criteria is going to get a red highlight. Now for a symbol, only the color really applies. The weight, line style, and fill, that's more for linear elements, and polygons for the fill, and they don't really apply to the symbol, so there's no reason to set them. But they can be set to a different level, or default means just whatever the original symbol was. So as I showed before, you can pick a different color. We can pick blue, or I'll change it back to red just to leave it like it was. And that's the simple highlight. Now in the next part we'll go over the regular highlight, which is the more complicated one, and you'll see how it differs. Okay, so let's look at a regular highlight instead of the simple highlight. The demo data has a couple of examples of this. I'm going to select over here the highlight gas mains by pressure, and you'll notice here the type is highlight. I'll call it the regular highlight just to make it easier to understand the difference. And everything here is the same. The category here is gas. The feature list is a gas feature now. The criteria, however, is true. This means I want to process every gas main that's in the view. And the reason we do it this way instead of the individual criteria for each type, because we're highlighting gas mains by pressure, which in the demo data there's only a low pressure and a medium pressure gas main. And we could have a simple highlight that only highlighted the medium, and then another simple highlight that only highlighted the low pressure, and it would achieve the same thing that we're doing here, but this does it all in one. And so we're going to do all of the features where our highlight is our type, and we have different options here. The main option is we have to specify a color, weight, line, style, map. Now these are already predefined. You'll notice over here there's a map setup button. That's where you define them. And when there's a couple here, there's this EG phase, and there's G pressure, and this is gas pressure. This was set up specifically for this highlight. You can do it on visible only or all features, and you have a map value. And this map value, this is an expression, even though it's just a value, a single value, but it's taking the G-pipe table and finding the pressure value for each one of the features that meets this criteria in your gas mains, which is all of them, and is going to get this value or compute this value and look it up in this map. And that map will map a value to a color, weight, line style. Now, let's just look at one real quick. Our value, and these are predefined, you can create a new map, you can add a new item to it, and for each item you can specify a value, a color, a weight, a line style, and a fill. And you can have as many of these as you want, but you're going to have to add them all in. And you can, they don't have to be the value that's in the database. They have to be the value that matches your map value expression. So it's a little more flexible than you might think, because you could have a fairly complex expression here that reduced a lot of different things down to just a few different entries in the map table. So I'm going to exit out of that. Well, before I exit out, the high is red, the medium is orange, and the low is blue. That's what it's basically doing. So whatever this value for the feature evaluates to, it's going to look up in this map and use the color, weight, line style, and fill from that map to apply for the highlight. The difference from the simple highlight is the simple highlight always applied the one color, weight, line style, and fill to every feature that met the criteria. Now, it does have one other option here. You can use a default value so that if this map value doesn't find a match in the map table, then it will use a default, which you can specify, and it'll use that for all of the ones that don't match an item there. And that can be useful too, because you may only want to highlight a few things of many things, and then the rest can just be some default color, and that's what this option is for. So I'm going to turn this on so we can see what it's doing, and you'll see that it highlighted a bunch of gas mains. Now I'm going to turn the emphasize on just so we can see it a little better. The blue was the low pressure, these are all low pressure, and the orange is the medium pressure. And if I zoom in a little bit just to get a better view, I'll pan over just a little bit. If we review one of these, you'll see this one was indeed medium pressure, and if I review one of these blue ones, it's low pressure. And that's the more complicated highlight. And I find that I use the simple one more, but the simple one, if you're doing something pretty complex where you want to map or highlight a single feature in several different colors based on the value, then this is definitely the easiest way to do it. Otherwise, you're going to have to create a separate action as a simple highlight for each one of those colors you want to highlight or styles you want to highlight. And if you have a lot of them, then that's a lot of actions, and your performance is based on how many actions are being processed, because they're all processed individually. And in this example, there's two different ones. We could have two different simple highlight queries versus one. That's not that big a difference. But if you had a bunch, then the performance would definitely decrease if you were using simple highlights for many different ones, especially since this can do it all in one. Okay, so now I want to go through and create a highlight from scratch. And I'm going to turn off the highlight gas mains by pressure. And I'm going to say new. I'm going to give it a name. I'll call this demo 1. And I'm not going to copy it from another action because I want to define everything myself. But you could select one of the previous or existing actions and it would just copy all of its values into it. But I'm not going to do that. I just want to create a fresh one, and this one's going to be a highlight by material. And and I'm going to give it a maximum zoom level of 10,000 just so it'll always be on for this demo. And I'm going to pick the gas category. I'm going to again pick the gas main. This time I'm going to pick just the gas line and not any of the other components. And the criteria, we'll come back to that. I'm still going to pick simple highlight just to start with. The default color is red, and I'm going to apply it, and you'll see it highlighted. Since criteria was true, it's going to pick every gas main in the view and highlight it this color. This isn't very useful, but that's what you get by default when your criteria is true. But let's say it's something a little more complicated than that, and I'm going to zoom down here and get a gas main so we can look at some of the attributes. I'll zoom back out, and since we're doing this highlight by material, I can pick one. There's material and the short name PVC. I'm going to use the short name because it's less to type, and I'm going to change my criteria to be, I'm going to clear it out so it's not true, and then I'm going to find my G pipe table, and then I'm going to find the short material name. Now I'm going to double click on it to get it up there in the expression, and I'm going to say equals PVC. I'll validate it. Everything was fine, and then I'm going to say apply. And I have to scoot some stuff around. You'll see there's less stuff highlighted now. So there was a lot of gas main that was PVC. Okay, so let's create one more with a different material. Now, I'm not sure what another material is. I think one is ductile iron. But the easy way to figure out what it is we have all the gas mains that are PVC highlighted, so we just have to find a piece of gas main that's not highlighted, and it will be something else. So yes, here's one that's ductile iron. So, and the short name is DI. So let's create one for that. I'm going to say new. I'll say demo 2, and I'll just create it from scratch. I'll say highlight by ductile iron. I'm going to pick the gas category, the gas main line. Let's pick the feature component, gas main line. And we're going to change our criteria to be G-pipe, short material. Oh, it didn't get the true out there. I'll delete that. Material equals DI. Say OK. And we're going to be a simple highlight. And for these, I'll make them, let's make them this blue color, cyan. And just to be different, let's make it thicker. And you can see them, it's also dashed. It's a little hard to see the blue. We can make them a different line style. That makes them a little easier to see. We can make them even thicker than that. There. So now we have the red is PVC and the blue is ductile iron. I think there's even more gas main than that. Let's see what these are. These are polyethylene. So we could even make another one and do polyethylene, which was PE. Now, we can do this again with a regular highlight and do it all in one dynamic graphic action. And I'm going to do that next just to show how to do it. So I'm going to turn these two off. I have to apply it before it let me go to the next one. Okay, so let's start with the fresh one. I'm going to say biomaterial. I'll say main biomaterial. And I'll give it a 10,000 threshold. I'm going to say gas. I'm going to do feature component gas main line. We're going to leave the criteria true this time, and we're going to say it's a regular highlight. Now what we don't have here is our map, so we need to set up the map. I'm going to say new map. I'll say material, and we need to add a few values to it. I'm going to say PVC was 1. I'll do another one for ductile iron. We'll make it blue like we did before, and I'll change the weight and the line style again. And let's do one more polyethylene, which was PE. Oh, I did the wrong one. Let me delete. I created a new map instead of adding a new item, so let's delete that. Pick material, add new item, PE, and let's make it green. We can also make it thick and solid. And that should get us going. We may have more to do on that. So the first thing I have to do here for the regular highlight is select the material map that we just added or created, and on my expression for what to use for the map, it's just going to be the G-pipe short material, just like we've been using. And as I've said before, this could be significantly more complicated, but for this demo, I'm just going to do the simple thing, and it's just one simple attribute out of the feature. And let's see if it works. There we go. So our red is the PVC, the blue is the ductile iron, and the green is the polyethylene. Now, I don't think there's any more, but we can see I might not have gotten all of the different materials. We can say use a default value if it finds one that it can't find, and let's see, what can we use that's different? Let's do this pink color and make it really thick. And there were a few right here. Let's make it solid so they're a little clearer. Let's see what they were. Galvanized iron. We could go back and add galvanized iron to our map, and it would work the same. If there were other ones besides galvanized iron, then we would need to do that, because there would be several of the same thing. You couldn't just say they were all galvanized iron. So why don't we do that? Map setup, material. I'll add a new item, GI, and I'm going to make it a different color. I'll make it a dark blue and solid. Apply that. Let's change that back. So now our default doesn't. Well, let's turn it back on. There's still a little bit of something that I haven't gotten the table. Let's see what they are. Steel. I'm not going to do every one. You could do every one, but the default will pick up anything that you didn't catch. So we have a pretty good. I think that here was some right here that wasn't caught because it's pink. See, it's reinforced plastic mortar, so it's yet something else. Now, if you're familiar with your data, you could find out what all the different ones were and make a complete map, but that's what the use default values is for. It'll help you find them pretty quickly. And this is basically the same thing that we were doing with the simple highlights, except I did it all in one instead of having to have a different simple highlight for each different material type. So it's definitely easier to do it this way. It's just that if you're only wanting to highlight one thing with a complicated criteria, then it's definitely easier to use a simple highlight for that. But if you're doing multiple things based on an attribute and want to map it to certain colors, this is definitely the way to go. Okay, so that concludes this video on dynamic highlighting. I hope everybody learned something, and thanks for watching.